You're listening to Kate Palmer from sparkletart.com. Today, I'm going to create a monochrome journal page using my Copic products. I have some really pretty Fab Scraps paper as the background, not that you can see much of it when I'm finished, and I've just cut it to size so that I can glue it into my journal when I'm done. Now this is only an A5 size, so it's not going to be particularly a huge page, but it will be exactly what I need it to be. So this is part of the Australia series from Fab Scraps, and it's sort of like a nice travel set. Now I'm making it to fit into my Express It mixed media journal. This is one of the new releases from Express It, and it's got really nice heavy cardstock, so it's great for mixed media work. Now I've torn the other side of the paper into little strips for some texture, and I've made sure that I've got a lot of sort of uneven edges. I've glued these onto my background and covered it with some gesso. Now it doesn't matter what brand, just don't use anything that's too heavy. You want a little bit of the colour and a little bit of pattern peeking through. So I've used my Express It gel glue to glue these down, and it doesn't really need something quite this heavy duty, but I will also be using this same glue to glue on my mixed media elements, and they do need something that has a little bit more stick than usual. So just adding a little bit and overlaying and overlapping to build up some texture and some interest for the base of the piece. At this point I'm going to add my second coat of gesso, just to sort of give the background a more even colour. Now this will also make sure that all of my Copic product sits on top of the paper rather than sinks in, which will allow me a little bit more time to move the colours around and will mean that they react with the Copic colourless blender a lot more than they would if they were soaking in on paper. Now I'm also going to use some of these Love to Travel embellishments from Fab Scraps. And I'm just sort of taking one of the original pieces and cutting it out and using the individual elements rather than using it as a camera shape. So this will be pretty cool. Now that I've got all of this extra texture on top and the base layer has dried, I'm going to add a little bit of raised pattern. I'm going to use my Chromacryl texture paste. You can use any kind of texture paste as long as it's sort of one of the drier ones, like a modelling paste. Anything too wet and this will bleed under your stencil, which is not a good look. So I'm just using the little stars from Fab Scraps, and I'm just going to drag in an imperfect way across the pattern. So I don't want it to be exactly a square of stars or all of the little stars to be perfect. I'm sort of doing it messy so it looks a little bit grungy. Now as always, go and wash that texture paste off your stencil the minute you are finished, because if it dries on there, you'll never be getting it off. Now I'm just going to add a little bit of freehand texture paste to the edges to make sure that it doesn't sort of sneak underneath, and just scruffy up those edges a bit. It'll just give me a bit more interest around the edges and a little bit more texture for the page. Now that the gesso has dried on those camera elements, I'm just going to add these on top and over the stars. You'll see a bit of everything peeking through by the time I'm finished. Now this needs to dry before you can continue on, so glue everything down and then just leave it alone for a little while. Now the next step is adding some Copic various inks, and I'm going to use E25 and E59, both really pretty browns. Now to start with, I'm using the Copic inks to tint the gesso. Now you could use paint to do this if you wanted to, but I wanted to make sure that all of my colours were really well coordinated, so I'm using the same products for all my colour. So after tinting the gesso, I'm just painting over the background again, making sure that I've got in all the little nooks and crannies, and still leave a tiny little bit of that background peeking through. So you can see now it's sort of a beautiful vintage brown colour. Still quite subtle because I didn't add very much of the various ink to the gesso, but it helps make that texture stand out. Now the next step is adding a few glazes, so I'm using some golden glazing liquid, and again those same two colours of Copic various ink. Now this is kind of fun because you never quite know what you're going to get. So I've just squirted a little bit of the glazing liquid onto my project, added a little of the Copic Various ink, and I'm just sort of mixing it up like it was a paint palette, and spreading this over the top of my textured page. Now for me, this wasn't quite dark enough, so I'm adding some of the darker colour, and I'm just going to go over that again. I really want the glaze to pick out the yummy texture in the background. Now after you've added it and let it sit there for a minute or so, you don't want it to be completely dry. I'm just using a baby wipe to take some of that colour off. So what you'll notice is that it really pulls into that texture and highlights the texture. And you just keep working it with a baby wipe until it's the colour that you like. If you'd like to take more colour off, just swap to a clean baby wipe and then let that dry. Now once dry, I'm going to be using my colourless blender, and I've just got that in one of the refill bottles. I also add that to a mini mister. And I've got 3 different colours of Copic marker. So I've got E47, E18 and Black 100. And I'm going to be adding a little bit more colour and texture with these. As I said before, add a little bit of that Copic colourless blender to your mini mister so that you can spritz it. Now this is safe to use. It doesn't have any harmful chemicals in there. You can safely use it, although I do make sure I'm in a well ventilated area. Now I'm going to start with my mid-brown tone, and I'm going to be using this to edge all of those little bits of textured elements. I'm also turning it on its side and sort of using it like a pencil to go over some of that texture and just sort of pick it out. I'm adding a little bit around each of the edges. It's going to help frame the piece, and I'm just basically tracing around what's already there. It doesn't seem like much, but just wait and see what happens to it later. Now going over this with the darker brown, and just to add a little bit more interest, and again the black. Now use the black sparingly, don't go everywhere. In fact, I've used this quite sparingly. And as another little trick, you can ink up your stamp using your Copic marker, spritz a little bit with the mini mister filled with various ink, and use it as a stamp. So I've just done this over the background a little bit to add another textural element. That because it kind of looks cool. It's lots of fun to do too. You kind of never know quite where it's going to end up, but I really like that. Now for the fun part. I'm adding some of my Copic marker to a little plastic lid that I've got. It's actually the lid off the mini mister. Doesn't do much when you use it like that, but if you spritz it with a little bit of the colourless blender, again, you can use it as a stamp. So I'm just adding a few little circles here and there. Now, attack this with the colourless blender in the mini mister, and you can see how it runs across the background. It sort of reactivates and allows the Copic Various ink to flow almost like a watercolour. Now this won't work if it's just on paper. You may get a little bit of movement, but you won't get this beautiful wicking effect, and it's because it's on the gesso. Now, it wasn't enough that I've coloured my background with my Copics. I'm going to colour all of my embellishments. Now, I'm going to fast forward through this bit quite quickly because I really didn't do anything interesting. I have coloured all of my embellishments, both pieces of fabric, paper, lace and metal and chipboard, just by sort of blobbing the colour on. There was no rhyme, no reason. I wasn't trying to colour anything in specifically. I was just adding colour to all of the pieces so that each of them had a little bit of colour on them. I've then gone through and dripped some various inks over the top to intensify the colour in some areas, and then I've spritzed the whole kit and caboodle with the mini mister containing the colours blender. Now this is the background as it's turned out. Now the little spots I've airbrushed on with my Copics. I'm sorry I forgot to record that part, but I'm now ready to embellish. Know all those embellishments once they're dry perfectly coordinate with the background because it's all the same colours. So you've got shades and tones of all of that, all perfectly coordinated, which was kind of a cheats way of doing it, but I love how it looks. So I've played around with the placement for a while and cut a few things to size, and now I'm just using that same glue from Express It to add all of the little embellishments to my background. So I love the Copics over the fabric and the lace. I love how it looks different on all of the elements. Some absorbed the colour and looked quite dark, others repelled it a little bit and came out sort of more of a pastel shade, but wow, really yummy. So glue everything down, make sure it's exactly how you want it, and then allow it to dry. Once it's dry, you can then trim off any little bits that are hanging over the edge of ribbon or chipboard or anything else, and it's ready to mount into your journal page. Now, of course, my page wouldn't be complete without a little sparkle, so I've flicked some Moonshadow Mist over the background to give beautiful little brassy spots of yumminess like here, and I've added some copper or brass toned mica flakes. Now, I've glued these down and then let them completely dry and then brushed the page off with a paintbrush, and you end up with beautiful sort of pops of metallic colour and a page like this. I hope you've enjoyed this. I'll be back with more soon.